Let's start with WCRS, one of our favourite functions. This is sterling against all its majors. If I was to say to you, Richard, the real beneficiary of a Trump victory would be the pound, would you have believed me?
It wouldn't be obvious, would it, Mark? It's not the first thing that springs to mind. I think what we've seen this week, and this is true with sterling, this is true with a lot of other different trades that we can talk about, is that the sort of the consensus trades, or the trades that everybody had on before the result, a lot of them have just gone the other way. And I think there's a lot of crowded positioning in the pound, everybody looking at Brexit risk and thinking, I want to be short sterling. And if anything, that crowded positioning has been unwound. Not necessarily for any reason, that I think that just a lot of these consensus trades have been unwound, and the pound has been a big beneficiary.
You were talking before the election, and you said key levels for sterling if Trump wins is going back to, if he loses, going back to sort of flash crash days, and of course if he wins, going back to before flash crash, sort of in the mid 120s. This is the pound index, measures sterling against seven of its peers. What sort of upside is there now, Richard, for sterling, given the onus, the focus now seems to be on the euro area and all those elections and referendums that are taking place? It almost seems like the political risk has moved from here to the continent.
I think it very much has, Mark, and if anything, the election of Donald Trump really does sharpen the focus that there are a lot of sort of political risks involved in Europe. We've seen the UK, big political risk, big shock to the system. The pound has suffered. We now see what has happened in America. As you said a few minutes ago, we've got the Italian referendum, we've got elections in Austria, Netherlands, Germany, France. I think this has really been an eye-opener for people, saying that there's a lot of political risk in Europe over the next year, and judging by what's happened in the UK and the US, don't be surprised if we don't get a big shock.
Richard, not all the chickens have come home to roost here yet either, right? There's still some political risk potentially here in the United States associated with the US dollar. And aside from the pound, the dollar did quite well in the wake of the election, particularly versus the peso, which has been the big sort of banner election trade, right? What happens to the peso now? What are people going to be watching for?
Well, Julie, I think, you know, once the result came out, and this was very sort of early morning here in London, we looked at the chart, and the peso just cratered. It was about 8 or 9% drop against the US dollar. Then we kind of traded sideways for the past couple of days, and now the peso has fallen to a record low against the US dollar, with the dollar up over 21 peso, and that's a big move. And I think, given the rhetoric that we saw in the campaign, it'll be interesting to see if that rhetoric turns into actual policy. We know that Mr. Trump is very vocal against the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is something I think that investors think will really harm the Mexican economy, and have sold the peso on the back of it. Now let's see how this pans out. We had a very conciliatory victory speech from the president-elect, but let's see if that's the way the first 100 days goes, let's see, or let's say see if the rhetoric that we saw during the election campaign is what dominates. It'll be really interesting to watch, and I think as interesting as 2016 has been, I think 2017 could be even more interesting, Julie.
Yeah, and also something that we've seen in the past several days is some of the so-called haven trade has unwound, right? You've seen some selling of Japanese yen. What's happened in the Swiss franc is a little bit more muted here. So given the trends we're seeing in those havens, what's your takeaway?
Well, I think if you look at Treasury yields have spiked. We've seen equities do very well in the U.S. And as you say, there's been selling of yen as risk sentiment seems to have improved. We're getting a warning sign from the Swiss franc, though, because I would look at the Swiss franc as the ultimate safe haven, Julie. And the fact that it remains bid and in demand tells us that perhaps things aren't quite as rosy as we think they are, and there is perhaps a lot of uncertainty going forward. I mean, I think the election of Donald Trump asks as many questions as it answers, and I think investors putting their money into the Swiss franc is something that will serve as a warning sign.